My name is Gene Scheffler. I'm up there also. Smaller print, but thank you. I'm adjunct faculty here at the university, and I've had the pleasure of not only being the research advisor for Andrew, but also being one of his advisors. I teach a Teams project, and if you know anything about Andrew, you know he really embraces stuff, as in this topic and other things, many other things. He taught us in our team project the team workings of
Genghis Khan.
Genghis Khan. I was
Yep.
going to say Attila the Hun, kind of the same thing. Genghis Khan. So you can tell he can find and embrace, like I said, the topic and learning in anything he does. I'm going to give you a quick bit of bio on him, but first I'm going to ask this. Will you please shut these off if you have them? We're recording this and just be a little bit less disruptive, so thank you. Couple of things that he asked me to share. Holds a Bachelor of Art cum laude in history at St. Norbert College. Holds certificates in planned giving and advanced major gifts from the Institute for Healthcare Philanthropy at Madison, and served in North Philadelphia as a member of the Jesuit Volunteer Corps. That's some of the bio, so let me be a little bit more personal. I'll try to get through this.
This is unscripted, by the way.
Yeah, right. On a personal level, we're here, I think, on this snowy day, as many of you know, not the original date that this was planned because of a personal tragedy that Andrew had in his family, and I want to say, in working with him during that time, he demonstrated to me and his authentic leadership and his authentic humanness, and that's how I know Andrew. And he, in that time of personal, like I said, tragedy, he also had a very good helper that I just want to point out, a personal treasure, I guess I thought of it as the other day. He has his new fiancée, Sarah, as well. So, that's a bit about the personal life, and I think the legacy of Andrew that's very important to me, and I'm sure you all know it as well. So, with that, your story. Thank you.
Wow, thank you, Gene. And the joke is that I'm not going to be able to get through my vows in a few months, and this might be good practice for that. So I'm gonna compose myself and move on here. So I didn't know I owed this many people money, but thank you all for coming. As many of you have known, for over the past 10 months, I've been fascinated by this idea of the ethical will and legacy creation. And so, without further ado, I'm going to present to you my research findings on nothing to remember except the story, how the ethical will inspires authentic leadership. Before I go too far ahead, some folks aren't familiar with the medium with which I'm going to present, and this is called Prezi. It's similar to PowerPoint, but it's a bit more dynamic, and I like it. In general, I think PowerPoint can get a little boring. And with Prezi, it moves around a little bit, and it uses a giant tapestry, and so you'll see the screen kind of zoom around like a supercomputer arm. And I think it really helps to tell the story, and so it works well since what I'm about to talk about is, in effect, all storytelling. I'm going to start with the year 1486, which, besides being a really good year for wine, I promise it's the last bad joke I'll make, was also an important year in my family. 1486, my family was involved with a Norbertine Abbey in rural Scotland. Gene, you got me. I'm starting to choke up. My family was involved with a rural abbey in Scotland. And as I kind of started, this is way before St. Kate's, doing primary research and trying to figure out more of what this religious community was all about and how it tied in with my family, I found myself more and more interested in what this abbey was doing for the community. And as I kind of went even further, I found a character jumping out of history, and this is likely a great-great-great-uncle, 18 times removed, named Abbot Thomas McCulloch. Abbot Thomas was the last abbot of this medieval abbey before the Reformation happened, and from everything that I could find, he was a really good leader. I was interested in what his life was all about, and I wanted to know from him what he thought about living a good life, what kind of life lessons he'd have to share with me, what kind of experiences he had, what what leadership experiences he wanted me to carry forward. So when people ask me how I got into the St. Kate's program, I didn't do it for work. It wasn't for a promotion. You could say I really prayed my way into this course, into this program. And so I needed something when I did this action project to sustain my interest for 10 full months, which is a really long time when you're studying just one topic, as many of you in here who have advanced degrees understand. So with that, I took two ideas and I combined them. And I took the ethical will, which is an ancient Judaic legacy instrument. It transfers values rather than valuables. And it's similar to a legal will that bequeaths the valuables. But the ethical will gives you values, it gives you stories, it gives you life lessons. And that goes all the way back to the patriarch of Israel named Jacob. And with that tradition, the Jewish people used it going forward to maintain their culture through upheaval, through growth, through change, and through challenges. It still continues as a legacy instrument to this day, which is something I'll talk about a little bit later. It's also become a secular legacy instrument, and it's oftentimes called a legacy letter. Same format. It articulates one's values. It allows a person to share life's lessons and wisdom. And I think even most importantly is it allows someone to offer blessings. And again, I'm going to talk about that in a moment as well. The ethical will, over its thousands and thousands of years, has gone from being an oral tradition to a written tradition. And that's where I took this legacy letter, the ethical will, and combined it with a leadership theory called authentic leadership. Oh, I'm a little bit too fast. Specifically, I looked at authentic leadership as defined by Bill George. And many of you know him as a Medtronic CEO who's gone on to Harvard, and he's on the faculty there, and talks about this theory of authentic leadership. George stresses personal growth over time in this theory. In particular, he looks at reflection on practical experience and how that helps a leader, and the development of legacy. It's been a rough month. All of you know that, and so I thank you. And the development of legacy in a leader as she or he moves forward and progresses in life. Most importantly, this theory is predicated on a leader's self-awareness and self-knowledge. In order to do that, you really have to develop your emotional intelligence. And with that self-awareness and self-knowledge and honed sense of self-awareness, you use the 5 dimensions of authentic leadership. And that's what Bill George came up with. Pursuing with purpose with passion, practicing solid values, leading with heart, establishing connected relationships, and demonstrating self-discipline. So I took these 2 components. I took the ethical will, and I took Bill George's theory of authentic leadership, and I came up with a research question: how can the process of writing an ethical will inspire George's 5 dimensions of authentic leadership in its writer? So it's all about what you go through as the writer and what that does to you. My methodology was fairly straightforward. I did an extensive literature review both on the ethical will and authentic leadership theory. With authentic leadership theory, most scholars don't agree on anything except that it's based on self-awareness and self-knowledge. So that's really why I focused in on Bill George's specific components of authentic leadership. I also did rather in-depth qualitative interviews with a relatively small sample size, but I used subject matter experts, ethical will practitioners. My questions focused on best processes for creating an ethical will, and I explored how George's 5 dimensions of authentic leadership can be defined and honed when writing an ethical will. Because of the ethical will traditions, I did 2 sample sets within the larger sample. I had a Jewish sample set and a secular sample set, and each one was an ethical will practitioner. All were over the age of 50, men and women. They were all subject matter experts, as I mentioned before. Many of them have written books. All of them facilitate ethical will workshops and work with individuals on writing ethical wills as well. The first ethical will practitioner I interviewed is a family physician. The next is a social worker. And then a rabbi emeritus and biblical scholar. So that was my Jewish sample. My secular sample included an estate attorney, a professional writer, and an English professor. So I interviewed all 6, and I did a basic thematic analysis. I compared themes from each set. I compared them against the literature and triangulated my findings. And then, as I'll show you in a little bit, I recommended a set of best processes for how an authentic leader can create a personal ethical legacy. So the key findings here, first, ethical will is a leadership instrument. It's clear that the ethical will is a wonderful legacy instrument, but it's never been specifically used for leadership. My findings demonstrated that the process of writing an ethical will served to inspire and enhance everyone I talked to, my entire sample, it served to inspire and enhance all of their leadership practices. So in terms of authentic leadership, it's on a continuum. These individuals, in my opinion, are all authentic leaders, but the process of writing an ethical will enhanced and inspired their leadership to even greater heights. When I looked at leadership, and oftentimes leadership gets confused with management, gets confused with administrative kind of challenges in our society, and leadership for me is much broader, and I used the definition provided by a scholar named Peter Northouse. Leadership is a process whereby an individual influences a group of individuals to achieve a common goal. And indeed, with that definition of influencing a group of individuals to achieve a common goal, the ethical will does influence people specifically by instructing others on how to live a better life. We also, in this leadership program, look at a theory of leadership similar to Bill George and authentic leadership called transformational leadership. And we look at 2 scholars named Kouzes and Posner. They would also define the ethical will as a leadership instrument because, as they write, quote, leaders are able to develop an ideal and unique image of the future for the common good. Then I went on to explore the various dimensions that Bill George talks about with authentic leadership. The first is pursuing purpose with passion. And here I examined how the interview subject viewed their sense of life purpose before and after writing an ethical will. Now, the literature noted that a strong sense of life purpose is often tied to a strong sense of leadership. All 6 of my sample, described a strengthened and clarified sense of life purpose and leadership, whether their roles were spouses, parents, or as members of the community. What I found fascinating was that every single person used language associated with passion. They said fascination, love. They talked about having energy when it came to the ethical will and how it inspired them to act out in the community as leaders. A quote from the estate attorney demonstrates how the ethical will inspires passion in one's life and leadership purpose. And he was emphatic when he said, "It changed me." The next dimension is practicing solid values. Here I examined how the interview subject reflected on significant values when writing, and if that process motivated him or her to express those values in new ways. Now, the whole point of the ethical will, the raison d'etre of the ethical will, is that it's designed to communicate values. And the literature also noted that personal values are integral to authentic leadership. Again, everyone in my sample described a painstaking reflection process of sifting through which stories represented values. Rarely did the folks in my sample talk about a laundry list of values enumerated on a page. These are life values. Oftentimes the stories themselves held the values. This quote from the English professor demonstrates how the writing process solidifies personal values. It wasn't a dramatic change, but the process caused him to express his values in new ways. I combined two dimensions when I was looking at my questions because they're related. I'm going to talk about that here. With leading with heart and establishing connected relationships, I examined how the interview subject and their clients experienced emotion while writing their ethical wills, and if that process strengthened their relationships with others. Here, Sarah gets a special mention because she helped me articulate this question in a way that opened it up for research, for my research subjects to actually talk about their values. It's a challenging thing to do. The literature suggested that authentic leaders experience emotions in a healthy manner, and they have appropriate expressions when communicating those emotions with others. This trait that they work on, this trait hones their self-awareness and self-knowledge and helps a leader establish and maintain healthy relationships. Every person in my interview sample, every time I talked about this, they all said it's daunting to talk about emotion. It's daunting to face it. It's daunting to write about it. And sometimes people don't finish their ethical wills for that purpose, for that reason. It's too hard. And they all said, everyone who's gone through it has said, have a box of Kleenex next to you because you're going to be experiencing emotion. In particular, the rabbi said that writing an ethical will is an emotional experience. Identifying values basic to you is pure emotion. What I found fascinating is that everyone in my sample described how this writing process strengthened their relationships with others by experiencing emotions during the writing process. In particular, the family physician said this: you want to know people better and what shaped their values. It's a huge component of developing authentic leadership because it increases your self-awareness and self-knowledge. What was also fascinating was, and I mentioned this earlier in my talk, the component of adding blessings to your ethical will. I'll talk about that in one of my best processes, but I think this quote's fascinating. This came from the social worker. She talked about how blessings make the ethical will unique from other forms of autobiographical writing. The process opens the writer to new emotions, and it deepens relationships with others. Here's what she said, and I love this. As we bless people, we experience being blessed. The next dimension is demonstrating self-discipline. So again, here I examined if the writing process helped the interview subject gain greater insight into how he or she made life choices, and if it caused a greater sense of ownership of those choices. Now, the literature noted that authentic leaders practice self-discipline when making decisions. That's hard to define when you're asking people questions about how they do that. What's interesting is that everyone responded that the process encouraged them to reflect on life choices and helped inform new choices after they'd written the ethical will. The following quotes demonstrate how the writing process demonstrates self-discipline in a leader. This one came from my interview with a professional writer. The next came from the English professor. This is also one of my favorites. Otherwise, people call you a hypocrite. So you better be authentic. Moving beyond the dimensions of authentic leadership, another major component of what Bill George talks about with authentic leadership theory, in terms of honing that self-awareness and self-knowledge, is wisdom through stories and the crucible experience. I examined if the writing process helped the interview subject gain greater insight into how he or she, I jumped ahead. The literature identified a growth process called the crucible experience that I just talked about. With a crucible experience, authentic leaders choose to respond to a challenge. And regardless of the outcome of that challenge, they learn from it and they reframe their life stories and incorporate that challenge as a way to move forward and inform how they interface with others, interact with others. With that increase in self-knowledge, that increase in self-awareness, I wanted to explore whether a connection exists between the description of a crucible experience through the process of writing an ethical will and a corresponding increase in self-awareness and self-knowledge in the writer. This is where it got a little bit trickier. 4 of the 6 interview subjects wrote about a crucible experience. So I don't think it's necessary to put one in an ethical will, but I will say, having gone through this whole research process, I will say that I think it adds to it, and I'll go into that in a little bit. So 4 out of 6 write about a crucible experience. What's interesting also in that the literature identified a wartime experience, perhaps the Holocaust. The literature talked about, major earth-shattering societal changes that were crucible experiences. What my findings showed was that a crucible experience still has that psychological turning point where you see your life in a different way. But it doesn't necessarily have to be as large as surviving the Holocaust or surviving a wartime experience. In fact, my findings showed a range of challenges from natural childbirth to a humbling classroom experience as an adolescent, where a teacher actually referenced a character from a Broadway musical, and that reference was so poignant that it actually changed the way this interview subject lived her life going forward. Unbelievable. And this happened, when she was 16. So you talk about drama. That's joke number 2. What's fascinating is that the underlying theme demonstrated, and this was one of my favorite findings, the underlying theme demonstrated was a mentality of enduring optimism, regardless of whether or not the interview subjects included a crucible experience or not in their ethical wills. They all exhibited this enduring optimism, and perhaps it resonated with me because it's something that's part of my core values and part of my leadership philosophy. This quote from the family physician articulates that sense of enduring optimism. A major component of his ethical will was the relationship that he developed with his wife and how important it was to have her as a partner moving through life. I'm an optimist by nature, he said. Now, the rabbi offered a quote that was slightly different, and he did include a crucible experience. The rabbi wrote a much more traditional ethical will that was a shorter version. Others write longer ones. But I thought his comment was really fascinating. Also, his responses. Many of my interviews lasted, over an hour. I got along real well with all of them. The rabbi was much more succinct and kept things moving, whereas I wanted to be chatty. But I think, and I'll talk about this as I go into my into my recommendations for best processes. But I think the quote from the rabbi here illustrates how the crucible experience can add to a leader's overall credibility. Otherwise, you just come off as saccharine in your leadership philosophy. So recommendations for best processes. How do I want to take this research and move it forward? First and foremost, express gratitude. Gratitude inspires a person to influence others with strong leadership practices, and it encourages the ethical will to be revised through new experiences. And I think in my emotive state earlier, I may have missed that. The key point of the ethical will is that it's written in pencil. It's meant to be revised. The next considers life stories. Consider which life stories are most important for others to know that demonstrate personal values in action, and spend time reflecting on the details of each story's significance. In relation to authentic leadership in Bill George's dimensions, this action strengthens your emotional bonds with people. Offer blessings. Pretty simple. What makes them even more significant is reading blessings aloud. This makes the emotional process and the emotions that you're experiencing even more tangible. Next is inform and share. This came to me late while I was writing the best processes, and it struck me that just finishing an ethical will is itself an act of self-discipline, and just sharing it with others. But I think also the writing process itself doesn't have to appear as daunting, because it can take anywhere between 15 and 45 minutes for a draft. This isn't one of Robert Caro's books on LBJ. This is just a short legacy letter, joke number 3. Oh. Also, sharing your ethical will with others rather than leaving it until your deathbed, which is obviously the original, more traditional idea, but sharing it in the here and now encourages self-discipline by basically forcing one to be more intentional about how your daily behavior aligns with your values. Which is why you haven't seen it yet. And then finally, the crucible experience. As I showed with the quote from the Rabbi Emeritus, documenting such an experience establishes your credibility as a leader. So as I wrap up the process and I close this program, what I've been thinking about a lot, and what all of you have heard me in the workplace talk about a lot, because why do anything quietly? Where do I go from here? And that's really the conclusion that I have. And I'm going to close with a quote from Tim O'Brien. He's one of my favorite authors, and I'll put a plug in for one of our local colleges. He went to McAllister College just up the road. This is also where I got the title for my topic tonight. So that lovely woman over there, that good-looking, tall, lanky dude, are my grandmother and my grandfather, McIlree. And that is taken on their honeymoon. I'm going to be getting married almost to the day, 90 years after they got married. And I don't have an ethical will from either of them, but I do have stories about their leadership. My grandmother was a mother of 3, and by all accounts, she did more right than she did wrong as a parent. She was also a strong community leader in her Methodist church. And one of the stories from her funeral, I was just a little first-grade boy. And I filed this story away when the church burned down at 3 in the morning. She was right there. And she got up the next day to see what she could do to help. Similarly, my grandpa McIlree was a big animal veterinarian in rural Wisconsin, and he built a lot of rapport in the community. But he also served on the school board for, as my dad says, more years than I want to remember. And when my grandfather tried to get off the school board, the community voted him back in through a write-in campaign. They still have a little scholarship that gives out like $50 a year. And they did more right than wrong as spouses. They did more right than wrong as parents. And they did more right than wrong as community leaders. And so I have a strong desire not only to establish my own leadership legacy as a philanthropy professional, as a student of leadership, but also as a husband and a father. And it's not just establishing that legacy, but it's writing it down. And I hope with these best processes that you'll all take time to do that yourselves and to challenge yourself with the introspection that's necessary in order to live a really full life. So, thank you. And now we have time for some